it's always amazing to me that, like, because we assume, like, we deal with so much stress, we assume that we need the equal amount of anti-stress to counteract it, and that's actually not true. Like, sometimes even just 5 or 10 minutes of a walk outside, or a meditation, or mindfulness, or quiet time, or your favorite music, sometimes even just 5 or 10 minutes can counteract a big amount of stress. So, realize, like, we can implement this in small quantities, and it actually will add up to make a difference.
My next guest is Dr. Doni Wilson. She has her doctorate from Bastyr University. She is a female trailblazer who has been studying stress and health optimization for over 25 years. It started with how a history of sexual and/or physical abuse affected women in labor. Inspired to help her patients in Manhattan after the traumatic events of 9/11, Dr. Doni, as she is referred to by her patients, continued to research the effects of stress and published an article called Anxiety and Depression. It All Starts with Stress in 2009. She funded a retrospective research study of cortisol and adrenal levels in her patients and subsequently identified the 5 most common patterns of imbalanced cortisol and adrenaline levels subsequent to stress exposure. With her training and background in clinical nutrition and herbal medicine, along with groundbreaking research showing that neuroplasticity, regulation of gene expression, and optimization of cortisol are possible. Dr. Doni developed her stress recovery protocol. The outcomes of her research and her protocol were published in her books, The Stress Remedy in 2013, Stress Warrior 2018, and Master Your Stress, Reset Your Health in 2022. She has published over 600 blog posts and over 140 podcasts, and has appeared on local and national TV, radio, and in print publications. My next guest is Dr. Doni Wilson, and she is here to speak to us about stress. Welcome, Dr. Doni.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I am so excited to have you and to speak with you about your expertise, which is stress, which is huge when it comes to healing.
It
So
really is. It's a lot of times we don't realize, like, we get so used to the stress that we're exposed to every day. It's so familiar that we just think it's normal. And so to be able to really take a closer look and say, actually, how is this stress affecting me in my body, and what can I do about it so it doesn't have a chance to cause health issues, like including for the bones?
yeah, that's what's interesting. So that whole witness is what I like to say. You know, if you're in it, if you're in the thick of it, you don't see it happening. And when you stand out of something, you kind of get that perspective of what's going on. So there's something you say that I think is great, is that stress is not a one size fits all model. So I'd love you to explain what that means.
Well, a lot of times when we become aware of stress, we assume that it affects us all the same. Like, we might assume, like, people will say, "Oh, yeah, my cortisol's probably high," or, "Oh, stress doesn't bother me. I'm an adrenaline junkie." Right? These are things people will say to me when I'm in conversations, even sitting next to each other on an airplane. This is what people will say to me, and I'm like, interesting, because stress doesn't affect us all the same way. Some of us, cortisol is too high, or certain times of day. Others of us, cortisol is actually too low. And it's also possible for adrenaline to be too low. So cortisol and adrenaline are the main stress hormones. And we can talk more about that. But when we're exposed to stress as humans, which is normal, by the way, we're not trying to have zero stress. We're just needing to understand how the stress we're exposed to affects our stress hormone levels. We want our stress hormones to respond in the moment to protect us, right? If the alarm goes off, we want our adrenaline and cortisol to help protect us, or help us go into action of what needs to happen. So that's not the problem. We want a healthy stress response. The problem is when we get stuck in stress mode, is what I call it. where it's just like we're so constantly exposed to stress that our cortisol and adrenaline are constantly trying to protect us, even if there's not even a stress at the moment. Our bodies get into a pattern of constantly reacting, and that causes a disruption in the healthy levels of cortisol and adrenaline. And that's where it becomes a not one size fits all issue. It becomes unique to each individual.
Yeah. So the interesting thing, backing up, because this word stress, and people don't always think of this, but we're talking about this like the biochemistry of what happens in the body. Where is the imbalance happening? And there's stress hormones that are secreted, whether, and we don't even realize it. That's what's interesting. There's so much going on below the surface, kind of like when a water polo player has to do egg beater legs to keep them afloat. So things are going on below the water. You would not see that person moving. You wouldn't see that that's happening. But we're speaking about what's happening in the body, how often it happens, what are the levels and the triggers that create all of this, and what does that eventually mean if you don't manage it. So you don't see it, so you don't always know to pay attention to it. I think that that's a really important thing here, is that these hormones you're speaking about are catabolic, and they are breaking down hormones. So they're going to break down aspects of our body. So that's why we need to be more aware of these hormones and what our patterns are. So yeah, it's one is because
That's the
I'm
thing, is it's about you want to have an optimal amount. So if we think of cortisol, for example, it's not that we want zero cortisol. We want an optimal amount. And sometimes that's hard to conceptualize. We're used to all or nothing or black and white. And when it comes to cortisol, we want the optimal amount for that time of day. In fact, as humans, optimal cortisol would be higher in the morning and gradually decreasing through the day. So as you're mentioning, when we're under chronic stress or we're having a responses and that cortisol level goes either too high or too low, it's sending stress signals throughout the body. And that includes to the digestion, where it's turning off our digestion. We don't digest well. We're more likely to have symptoms of, let's say, irritable bowel syndrome, which is known to be associated with stress, or stomach ulcers, or many other kinds of digestive symptoms, reflux. And it's because this cortisol is turning on, whether the cortisol is too high or too low, it's disrupting healthy digestion. It also disrupts our gut bacteria and our healthy intestinal cells. So we become very susceptible to health issues just based on how imbalanced cortisol affects the digestion. But cortisol also affects three other main systems in the body. It affects the immune system. So now we're more likely to have allergy reactions, autoimmunity, infections, even cancer, increased risk when we have this imbalance in our immune system that's caused by stress. The other system it affects is all the different hormones in the body. So you name it, from thyroid hormone to insulin to reproductive hormones, to every different hormone is basically, think of it as decreased function of hormones when our cortisol is imbalanced. And the other thing that gets completely thrown off is our nervous system, our neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA and dopamine. These are the messengers that have to do with our energy and our sleep and our focus. So if you're already feeling anxious or not sleeping well or feeling tired or headaches or anything in your nervous system, then we know, oh gosh, we got to go pay attention to your cortisol levels as well. The thing that's, because a lot of people will say to me, well, isn't this something that's getting checked already by my regular doctor's appointment? And what I like to emphasize is probably not. I mean, some practitioners will measure cortisol in a blood test, which is only at a single time a day. So now you're only finding out your cortisol at the time the blood was drawn. But in the conventional medical sense, like an endocrinologist is really only going to pay attention if your cortisol is way off the charts, either way too high or way too low. Then they're going to pay attention to it. But what I'm referring to is imbalances that maybe not even to that extreme yet, but they still are affecting your body. So you have to know that this is something that's not likely to get picked up in a regular doctor's appointment.
Yeah, this is a place of function, and specializing in bone health, you began saying how high elevated cortisol levels affect digestion. Well, the two things that build bones are nutrition. You need to be digesting, absorbing, and assimilating. And then you need to have energy to actually move your body and demand more. And then you spoke about hormones, and hormones are a part of bone health. And so for me, it's kind of maybe when we get, farther along in life, because it's the number one disease in menopause. 27% of the women over 65 have osteoporosis. So maybe it is a later stage of life disease. But what it is this slow erosion throughout your life. And if it's not managed or detected, and it's not something that conventional medicine is looking for, like you said, it's that one point. And are the two diseases they typically look for, is that Addison's or Cushing? Are they looking for, they're looking for adrenal dysfunction, where the secretion of these hormones is really off the charts. But
Yeah.
there's still the place of dysfunction and imbalance that's going to have a negative domino effect on so many other body systems. So it really is important to look at
Yeah.
this.
I'm so glad you're tying that connection to the bones, and that's exactly it. All of these systems are interrelated with the bones, and the bones is another thing that we a lot of times it sneaks up on us because we're not like right now in the conventional medicine. The main way to test the bones is to do a DEXA scan, but most women only have a DEXA after their menses stops happening. So somewhere usually between age, the average is age 51. So a lot of women don't know their bone status until age 51, and then depending on how often they have it checked afterwards. And men a lot of times don't even get a DEXA, so they have no idea that they're having bone loss. And so it really is here are our bones, which are so essential for our human body, and yet it's not something that really gets tests often in blood work either. So cortisol is usually not getting checked, and the bones are not usually getting checked. And so it's no wonder that we, at some point in our life, we get told, "Oh, you have bone loss," and it hits us out of nowhere. Like, how did that happen? Well, it's from this underlying current, as you talked about, that's behind the scenes
Yeah,
causing
how
trouble.
yeah, how did that happen? It's been happening, but we need to raise our awareness, and that's exactly the point. And when I meet women who are, especially when they're newly diagnosed, I mean, the rug gets pulled out from under you. Our bones are our framework. You can't stand, move, do anything without them. And then when you get that diagnosis and you feel like they're fragile and breakable, that's what people feel. You feel really fragile. So then you stop moving, which even makes bone loss worse. And it's a lot easier to maintain what you have than it is to rebuild bone. So even raising this awareness, even if you're not somebody diagnosed with osteoporosis or osteopenia, but really raising awareness to, I need to manage my stress, because you mentioned other diseases this could lead to, cancer and many other diseases. So this is really about kind of like stopping the leaks, being aware that there are leaks, and what are those and how do we pay attention to those?
Well, the thing is that even if you go into a doctor's appointment and they might say to you, well, just they might say to you as you're heading out the door, "Oh, you should reduce your stress." And the thing is, to me, that's just so annoying because, like, yes, we can look at our life and we can say, okay, are there places that I might be able to reduce my stress? But for most people, it's like, well, I need to have a job. I run my business. I need to make money. I need to take care of my family. I need to, so it can feel very almost more stressful to find out that stress is involved because you're just like, I don't know how I could possibly reduce my stress load right now. Now, what I like to do with people is help find even little small ways that we can reduce stress and to start to look at it differently and realize that there's stress coming from places that we didn't even realize. Stress from foods in our diet that are inflammatory. And if we can make some dietary changes, even to better balance our blood sugar levels, we're reducing inflammation and stress. Or there's stress coming from toxins in our environment. If we can go, okay, how do I choose different products, even self-care product, personal care products or toxins in my environment, filtered water, so I can reduce my toxin exposure. Those are stresses we can reduce. So there's things that we can little by little chip away at some of our stress exposure. But to me, the key is in how do we support ourselves through the stress? Because it's not like we can just go to a island and sit on a beach all day. That's not going to work either. So it's like, how do we take care of ourselves in our stress-filled lives? What can we do day in and day out that's going to help our bodies recover from stress? And I think that's the real problem, is that we're missing that part. We often are not taking breaks in the day. We might be going long hours without even feeding ourselves, or even sometimes it's hard to even find time to go to the bathroom. See, people tell me, it's like, how do we actually we need like a revolution of taking better care of ourselves in order to help support ourselves through the stress that we're exposed to. And by the way, Debbie, we're using the term stress, but I want to emphasize that this also ties back to what people refer to as trauma, including trauma from childhood. So if you know that you had adverse events, it's called adverse events in childhood, or traumatic experiences in childhood related to maybe your parents, or if there was substance abuse in your family, or any other kind of abuse for that matter, or divorce in your family. These are known traumas in childhood, which have in research been shown to not only be related to all different health issues, but including increased risk of fractures, increased risk of bone health issues. They actually study this, that when we have a traumatic childhood, it affects our bones. And it's like, but that's not widespread knowledge. And it's also not widespread that we can heal from that. There's things we can do to heal from our childhood trauma.
Yeah. And there's NIH studies that show that psychological stress leads to higher incidence of fractures, more bone density loss, because it stimulates, because from a biochemical metabolic perspective, whenever there is a trigger in your subconscious brain, so when you're talking about childhood trauma, and in yogic wisdom, it's even your lineage. So it's not just me in this lifetime, it's my grandmother, my great grandmother, my mother, it's who I am, like everyone that survived to be able to give birth to the next generation, the next generation, the next generation, has that patterned stress response or nervous system that then became mine. And so the way that somebody looks at me or says something or a smell is going to trigger or stimulate this quiet back brain that is always on the lookout to keep us safe. And that whole biochemical situation, that egg beater legs under the water, takes place. So you're right, there's the known stress, there's the perceived stress, and it is a big thing. So yes, even raising awareness, that would be number one, right? Raise awareness to that fact that it's not just about work less hours, take some time off. It's go deep and understand why do you feel this way, and when do you feel that you're not settled.
And to me, like we talked about how cortisol is not often measured in a conventional medical setting, but as you and I know, we can measure cortisol in a more, I call them specialty tests, in a more functional medicine way. There are labs that can measure cortisol at different times a day, and to me this is life changing. I hope everyone gets to measure their cortisol at different times a day, because it's so essential. From my research and my work, I feel like we should all know our cortisol levels and what they're up to. And it's not just measuring cortisol at one time a day. We're measuring cortisol at the time you wake up, and then the middle of the day, and then the evening, and the bedtime. Because again, it should be higher in the morning and gradually decreasing through the day. If we only measure it at one time, we could miss the whole rest of the picture. And not only that, but in my research, I saw that it's really important to also measure adrenaline levels. And adrenaline can be measured in urine, so that we're again seeing as much of a picture of how is stress affecting your body at this point in time. Because sometimes then people will say to me, well, is it just depending on the day? Is it going to be different tomorrow? And what I find is, from my research, is no, it's not that different from day to day. When I measure your cortisol and adrenaline, I'm seeing your pattern. It's almost like your fingerprint of how stress affects your system. And so it's that unique. It's that unique to say, oh, one person today, even I saw one patient where her cortisol was really low when she first woke up in the morning, but then it went up high by noon, and it was too high at the noon and the evening time. I hardly ever see that pattern in other patients. Other patients, it would be, let's say, too low in the morning and too low all day. Or maybe it's good during the day, and then it goes up too high at night. So there's so many different possibilities. And the reason it's important is because the treatment is different. So if it didn't make any difference in the treatment, we wouldn't even be measuring it. But it does make a difference in the treatment, because when someone has too high of cortisol, we're going to use different herbs and nutrients than if person has too low of cortisol. So if we want to be effective at getting it back to optimal, we need to know where we're starting from in order to give the right herbs and nutrients to get it where we're trying to go.
Yeah, and this is what makes it really hard, with functional medicine and not conventional. Conventional medicine is go to your doctor and have labs run with insurance, which is what most people want to do. Yet that's not where you're going to get the functional assessment. You're going to that's looking for disease. That's looking for disease, and then it's managing disease with surgery or medications. But this functional look, it requires functional labs, and I run a Dutch, so I look at a 5-point cortisol. Do you run that one as well?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
which is
You can do
great.
5 points. Then you get even another level of cortisol, like at least 4 or 5. Then we can see what's the cortisol up to, right?
Yeah, or even in the middle of the night when there's that insomnia panel. But yeah, and you were mentioning about herbs that some are, for the high level, some are for low. This is where things get tricky because we share this information and someone listening might say, "Oh, I think I'm really stressed and I have high cortisol. I need this herb or this supplement." But it's really not about just supplementing the symptom, because then that becomes just like medications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, some ways, except that the cool thing about some of the herbs and nutrients that help address imbalanced cortisol is that they're not, because the medication, we become dependent on it, right? We need that medication in every single day to have the same effect. Like if you're taking a high blood pressure medication, you have to take it every day if you want it to lower your blood pressure. When it comes to herbs, for example, that help when cortisol is too high, what I do with my patients is my goal is to use those herbs and nutrients to reset the system. We actually, the studies show it's resetting the receptors in the nervous system and retraining it that it doesn't need to keep signaling cortisol. What happens is when we're under so much stress for so long, the receptors don't respond right. And so the body thinks it needs to keep signaling for more cortisol because it's not getting that feedback. So we can use these herbs and nutrients to reset that feedback loop. So then we can actually, once it's reset, then the person doesn't require the same doses and maybe doesn't even need to take those herbs and nutrients anymore because they've reset the system. So in some ways, herbs and nutrients can work differently than medications if they can actually help our bodies get back to more of an optimal. But I agree with you in that we want to be thinking about this not just in terms of like taking another pill. We want to be thinking about this then as, what can I do in my day-to-day life that's going to help my body get the signals that it can turn off the stress response, that it's safe to turn off the stress response. And I think so much of correcting this issue is about creating a sense of safety. What is that to feel safe? You can ask yourself, what would your body need to know in order to feel safe and turn down the stress signaling? We need to be fed on a regular basis. We need to have hydration on a regular basis. We need to have regular sleep. We need to take breaks during the day. We need to, you see what I mean? Like, how can we need to spend time in nature. Like, all of the ways that we know if we do these activities each day, our body then is taking in signals that are anti-stress. I call them anti-stress signals. So it counteracts the stress signal and it starts to teach those receptors automatically to start shifting. I mean, as you know, with teaching yoga and meditation, those are also techniques that are known to help reset these stress signals. And I talk about this in my book too, the Master Your Stress book. I go through all the research on what I call recovery activities, things we can do on a daily basis that help to reset the signaling in our bodies so our bodies are not in that constant stress response.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So, yes, we need to have testing to make sure that the herbs and supplements we're taking are correct. So it's not just, oh, I think I'm high stress. I need, licorice root or whatever, because but it's no, you need to actually know what are the right herbs still, because herbs are effective. And like you said, then they can actually help to repattern or reset or rebalance, which is great. And now what you're speaking about, which is in your book, which is fantastic, is That there's things we could do too. This is not just about taking herbs or supplements. You know, we went from conventional medicine, where's the pill? Give me the pill. Then we go into functional medicine, where's the supplements, where's the herbs? And yes, they speed up recovery, they assist recovery. Some maybe will need for a really long time, but others, like you're saying, they can reset and rebalance. And then you spoke about the things that we say we know, oh yeah, I should be out in nature, I should get sleep. But what we're trying to convey here, and what you were conveying, I really think that's so powerful, is that we have to rebalance our biochemistry. This is intricate. It's like making a pot of soup. You're constantly figuring out, is this enough salt? Is this enough pepper? Do I need a little bit more water? And you get that perfect balance of soup. And it's the same thing inside. And what does that for our internal soup environment is that we work on sleep, that we go outside, that we schedule those breaks, not just say, oh, yeah, I know I need to, but rather start to make those steps, because you'll see that that will start to shift things.
Yeah, and even in small increments, it's always amazing to me that, like, because we assume, like we deal with so much stress, we assume that we need the equal amount of anti-stress to counteract it. And that's actually not true. Like sometimes even just 5 or 10 minutes of a walk outside or meditation or mindfulness or quiet time or your favorite music, sometimes even just 5 or 10 minutes can counteract a big amount of stress. So, realize like we can implement this in small quantities and it actually will add up to make a difference.
Yeah. Okay. So you call them anti-stress techniques. Is that what you call them?
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm,
So, and
mhm.
they're in your book.
They are, yeah.
Okay. You want to
Mhm.
share some of those?
And all of this that we've been talking about is in the book, so I love it. I love getting to talk about all of this. Yeah, I mean, what I use this acronym CARE, by the way. C is for clean eating. So some of what I talk about is how do we eat in a way that's going to be less stressful for our bodies, to drop our inflammation, help our digestion heal. The A is for adequate sleep. So anyone who's struggling with sleep or wants to improve your sleep, you're going to want that chapter that's all about ways we can optimize our sleep, because so much healing and recovery happens while we're sleeping. By the way, Debbie, I used to be a person who's like, I have so much to get done, I don't have time to sleep. And I think a lot of people feel that way, right? Or like, I don't want to go to sleep because that means it's going to be tomorrow and I'm not ready for tomorrow yet. But the thing is when I researched stress, I saw that how much good stuff happens while we're sleeping. We think we're doing nothing, but we're actually doing a lot, including our bones are healing while we're sleeping. So making sure you're getting at least 7.5 hours of sleep every night is really important. And then the R in care is for recovery activities, and the E is for exercise, which you already mentioned how important movement is for our bone health. So in the recovery activities, I went through everything, all the research, everything I could come up with, like everything from just even solitude. Sometimes we just need time to ourselves. And I really think we don't get that. We think we don't deserve time to ourselves or just being quiet sometimes, let alone there's a lot of research behind music and different types of sounds that can be very healing. Even just singing is helpful for resetting the vagus nerve. Maybe we talk about because a lot of the ways that these recovery activities work and anti-stress activities work is by resetting the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in our body, and it signals from the brain or nervous system out to our whole body, including all of our hormones, our heart, our digestion, and it signals from the body back to the brain. And the vagus nerve contains 80% of the signaling, the anti-stress signaling in our bodies. So what that means is, now the vagus nerve works automatically. We usually don't think about it. It's not like with your muscle where you're like, okay, I'm going to move my arm. No, the vagus nerve is just doing its thing without us thinking about it. But we can intentionally stimulate the vagus nerve by doing some of these anti-stress activities. So things like taking a deep breath. A lot of times when people are stressed, people will say, just take a breath, and it can be annoying to a person.
Mm-hmm.
But actually taking a breath is really helpful because it says to the vagus nerve, okay, I need some anti-stress signaling. And so literally, even just taking a deep breath, let alone there's such extensive breath work training that a person could do and treatment we can do with breath work, right? It's just
Yeah.
endless. But
Wait,
starting with taking a deep breath.
one thing
Mhm.
about that that's really interesting about this. So at my yoga therapy training is 1,000 hour. It's a clinical training. We're trained by doctors and we learn all this stuff. We did some vagal studies. We were looking about the
Yes.
vagal system or the vagus nerve. Here's one thing that's amazing. The diaphragm, which is a primary breathing muscle that lines the entire lower rib cage, not very many things go through the diaphragm. There's very little through it, but the vagus nerve goes through it. So this is why the actual physical act of initiating a deep breath, which means deep diaphragmatic breath, is actually going to stimulate that vagal nerve tone and stimulate relaxation.
Yeah, so we can choose that intentionally, just to remind us, like, because I always say we don't get an instruction manual with our bodies when we're born. But if I was going to write the instruction manual, this would be one thing at the top of the list is take a deep breath. Just intentionally taking a deep breath says to your body, I can let go of the stress. I need some counterbalance to the stress. And then it just goes on from there. We can use breath work with meditation, mindfulness, biofeedback. It's used with all these different techniques that have been well researched to improve the vagus nerve, or vagal tone is what it's called. Vagal tone is, we measure it sometimes with heart rate variability. If any listeners are using heart rate variability on a device, what it's showing is that when we're really good at both responding to a stress and recovering from a stress, right? This emphasizes again that it's not about having zero stress. It's about when there's a stress, I need to respond appropriately and recover optimally. And that's what we measure with the heart rate variability. There's this slight variations in the heart rate naturally. And so this all relates back to the vagus nerve and how well the vagus nerve is helping us respond and recover from stress. And yeah, there's so many things we can do on a daily basis that help with that. And to think that it actually does help your bones, because the better your heart rate variability, that means the better your cortisol and adrenaline levels, and the better the signaling throughout your whole body.
Yeah, this is what I say for bone health. We need to make stress our friend. So we use stress because you want to stress your bones out by pulling and pushing on them in physical movement. And I don't mean that in a harsh sense. I mean,
Yes.
flexing the joints, loading in, creating enough stimulation. And then with stress, the pathway of stress is that there's a reaction. So you see something, you react, then you respond, react, adapt. That's the pathway of it. So you respond to something and you make in that's your intelligent decision of how do I react to the situation. So you respond, then you react to it, then you adapt. And it's that adaptation, keeping it in a safe space. So whether you're doing that, stress is your friend for your bones, you're doing stresses like stress is the positive stress, right? So when you
Mhm.
challenge yourself, and on the Lululemon bags, Lululemon, when it came out, I don't know how many years ago, on the bags, it's some of the sayings, they have different quotes on their bags. And the one that really stood out to me was, do something every day that scares you. And it's like, I think I always avoid things. Like, I don't like going fast down. I don't like skiing down mountains. I don't
Mm.
like driving my bike down the hill. I get really nervous going fast. But every time I put myself in a situation where I challenge myself with stress a little like that, I'm so proud of myself for doing it. Like when you challenge yourself a little, then you learn how to manage it. And that's what it is. It's learning how to manage the stress so that it doesn't do all of this damage.
Yeah, I
Even
use the
like
word
this.
master. So that's why I named the book Master Your Stress, because like you're talking about, like, how do we harness it? How do we, and it's unique to each of us, right? We wouldn't be able to say, oh, this is exactly the right amount of a challenge for every person. It's about you getting to know how much can I push myself? Because when we push ourselves out of that comfort zone just a little bit, it's called hormesis. It can stimulate growth. It can stimulate the bones in a good way, but it's if we push past too much, that's when it becomes a damaging stress. And it's hard to learn that line for ourselves, right? We're so used to being willing to push harder. We end up pushing past the good zone into the danger zone accidentally all the time. And so it takes a lot of intention and awareness to realize, oh, how do I Yeah, how do I do just the right amount of increase in my weights in my exercise, training each, how do I do just the amount of going a little bit longer of a walk today? Like just push it a little bit, but if we go too far, that's when we run into problems.
Yeah, that's what it is. And so why does this matter? Because you don't want to have osteoporosis or cancer or diabetes. And so this is the what we look at, what we monitor throughout our lives. So we have to show up, and you said some things about stress, that word stress, really thinking about it. You talked about clean, like your care acronym, clean eating. Like that's, if people ask me, how do I eat? That's the word I'm going to use. I eat clean. I try to search out clean, water filters, organic produce, because it is, that becomes a stressor. That's one stress aspect, is what you bring into your body and what your body has to manage. So really raising our awareness to where are all of these aspects of stress, and then how do you develop those tools once you know what you're dealing with, and how do you manage that to be the healthiest version of yourself, to have the hormones, have strong bones, and be the healthiest version of yourself. I mean, isn't that what we all want?
Yes, and so here's what I did is I decided, okay, I see all this research, I all these good things, we know it can help, but what if our care for each of us is even unique based on our cortisol and adrenaline levels? What if someone who has high cortisol should be meditating at a different time of day or a different duration? What if someone who has low cortisol should be exercising differently than someone who has optimal cortisol? And so I started looking into the research to find this information. And that's also what I share in the Master Your Stress book. So what I do is I identify what I call stress types. There's 5 main stress types. The stress types are based on your cortisol and adrenaline pattern. So if you tend toward both high cortisol and high adrenaline, that's called a stress magnet. And if it's the opposite, if you tend toward low cortisol, low adrenaline, that's called the blah and blue type. So those are the two opposites. And then there's 3 others in between. There's the night owl, who tends to have high cortisol in the evening or at night. And then there's the sluggish and stressed, that has high cortisol with low adrenaline, and tired and wired, that has high adrenaline with low cortisol. These things are all possible and common. I've studied thousands of lab reports in order to identify what are the most common patterns in humans. And so what you can do is, in the book it has a quiz where you can go through and identify your stress type. And then based on that, in the rest of the book, I give you guidelines. Here's how to implement supplements based on your stress type. Here's how to implement care based on your stress type. And even here's how to create a daily routine, self-care routine based on your stress type, so that it's really individualizing your care for yourself, your support under stress.
Oh, that's awesome, because that's what we need. We need it to be individualized. And I think that that's really great. So I'm definitely recommending your book. I'm going to get your book, figure out what stress type I am. I'm trying to think about what I am. And this is great. So you're saying that the quiz that you've created will help identify this without somebody having to do functional lab testing through urine and saliva.
You can start there. And in fact, the quiz I put it on my website. So it's at drdoni.com. You'll see the stress type quiz at the top. And so you can even do the stress type quiz right there. And then you'll know your stress type. What I'm finding is the stress type quiz correlates really well to actual levels. Now, once you do the stress type quiz, and if you're like, wait a minute, I think, then you might still want to measure, like you might want to get the testing done where you can go, okay, let me double check and make sure where my cortisol and adrenaline levels are. But it's a really good starting place, because I see very high correlation between doing what your stress type comes out with the quiz, and then when I measure the levels, it matches up. So it's
Oh,
a
that's
really good
great.
starting place.
Yeah, that's great. And then you have recommendations of supplements. And do you have your own custom blends that you've put together?
Yes, so this is the thing, is I kept seeing so many patients would come to me, and they might have had their cortisol levels measured, but then I said, okay, well, which supplements are you taking? And they were taking completely the wrong thing. Even after seeing a practitioner, I was, and over again, I'm like, how is this happening that a person, let's say their cortisol is high and they're taking a supplement that raises cortisol more? I can't tell you how often this happens. And so I was like, okay, because it's confusing. You, when you search online or you go into a store and the supplement might be called something related to cortisol or HPA axis or adrenals. And so you're thinking, oh, this must be the right thing, but it's actually not the right formula for that person's stress type. You, many times. So I encourage anyone listening, if you're like, oh yeah, I've been taking this product, I encourage you to double check your stress type and double check that those ingredients are the right thing for your stress type. And yeah, so then what I did is I created a whole line of supplements, the stress type supplements, and they're based on the stress type. So if you're a stress magnet, here's the supplements that are right for you. So you don't have to be questioning or wondering if you're taking the wrong thing.
Oh wow, that's perfect. Yeah, because that's the thing too with supplements. People think that they're natural and they are, but like something, for example, cortisol. I mean, sorry, licorice root. Licorice root we use to extend the half-life of cortisol for people that have low cortisol. Yet you've got to be careful with people that have heart conditions. So
Or
there's certain
someone who has high cortisol, it would be the
yeah,
wrong thing.
right. And how would they know? Because you were saying that you had your two first had the N ranges, right? But then somebody might have elevated cortisol and low. So you
Yeah,
don't
you have
know
to do the
unless you're,
right
yeah.
timing. Yeah, like so licorice might be the best herb in the morning when the cortisol is low, but then it's a different herb and nutrient for when the cortisol goes too high. So in that case, we really need to be testing and looking more closely and carefully. And actually, in the book and in my work, what I also found is it's important to implement in a three-phase protocol where it's not just about one step, fix your stress. It's, we need to go step by step. And there's three phases. The first is what I call getting out of stress mode. Because if we're, as you say, I like this egg beaters. If you're just paddling like crazy and you're in a constant stress state, it's hard to rebalance things from that place. We need to first get out of stress mode. So that first phase is, how do we support the calming neurotransmitters? How do we decrease cortisol and adrenaline if it's too high? How do we help initiate some of these anti-stress techniques so that we can get you out of stress mode? Then phase two is about rebalancing everything that got imbalanced from stress. Then we can address cortisol that's too low, or adrenaline that's too low, or dopamine that's too low, or even unbalanced gut bacteria and other hormones in the body. We do lots of rebalancing. And then phase three is about maintenance, because we don't just want a temporary solution. We want this to actually help you solve this, master it, right? Not just manage it, but master it. So now you know your body and what your body needs, and you know you need to keep doing ongoing in order to maintain it. So phase three is really important in order to maintain over time.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm imagining, I know my experience working with women is mostly women, but working with women is that when you are in that first phase where you just want to stop it, you want to stop bringing in whatever's happening, you really want to stop everything. You're grasping for straws or you're so desperate to heal. What happens is it works once you start to bring in, whether it's stress relieving techniques, whether it's supplementation, lifestyle shifts, it works. And then 3 weeks later or a month later, whatever it is, you start to notice, oh, this is shifting, that's shifting. And that's when you can then go into that next phase. And then you do go, I just had a session with a client I've been working with for 6 months, and she's on a decent amount of supplements. I ran a lot of functional labs on her, found food sensitivities, lots of different imbalances. And she is really compliant with her protocol, with her diet, with all the things she needs to do, hydration, supplementation. And she said, I'm starting to not sleep well. And I said, you know what's happening here is you are truly reshifting your biochemistry. So now the thyroid meds that you're on are too much for you. And
Yeah.
the hormones you're on, she's on different, are too much, because she's actually been able to rebalance her own biochemistry, that she's not going to need the things she's on. And even the supplements, we shifted some of them. So
Yes.
there are those phases, and you do need to constantly adjust. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's really true. You then as you're it's such a cool thing. Sometimes it's like we've been aiming and we're like in disbelief. We're like, "Oh my gosh, my body's actually responding and healing." And then we need to adjust and find, "Hey, what do I need for maintenance?" Which is usually much less than what we needed to get you out of stress mode to begin with.
right. So let me ask you, what are the big symptom shifts that you see within like the first few weeks or a month, right? What are the big
Mhm.
symptom shifts that you know that the stress is really being managed here?
Well, one is anxiety. A lot of people talk, and it can show different ways for different people. But if like you have mind racing, and you're just feel like you can't even just get a thought in because your mind is just always thinking of what's the next thing to worry about, that starts to calm down. People talk about, oh, that buzz of anxiety is just the volume turned down. Also, people will experience just general improvement in mood. Feeling better motivation and looking forward to the next day, and creativity, as well as sleep. Definitely, there's improvement in sleep and energy levels. People will talk about, oh my gosh, I feel like I actually have the energy to think about exercising when before I couldn't even imagine exercising.
Yeah, the big thing, and this is important because people, it's our symptoms that we're trying, that's our signal, like do something. My
Yeah.
big things I notice with people, first of all, bowel movements become
Yes.
amazing because we know that when we start to shift, I mean, my program is healthy gut, healthy bones. And I really look at the gut and the relationship between nutrients coming in and are we digesting, absorbing. So I do a lot of gut work. So they
It's
start,
so important. The
it
gut
is.
health is so important for the bones. You wouldn't right away think, oh, the gut has anything to do with the bones, but the research is there, and that's so wonderful you're doing that because it's so key.
Oh, it's so key. It's everything really. I mean, the whether
Mhm.
it's the balance, it's where the hormones, the stress, cortisol, there's an aspect of cortisol, whether you're going to be in a digestive phase or a let me get the heck out of here phase.
Yeah.
So the symptoms that I see big shifts, like really big shifts right away. Weight loss,
Yeah.
regular bowel movements, improved energy, improved sleep. And who doesn't want that,
Yeah.
right?
There's it's
And
like the
then
basics. These is the things that our human bodies naturally do. We need to eat, we need to poop, we need to sleep. Like, and if we're not doing those things, we're not going to feel good.
right. And then my whole thing is stop slowing down, stopping or reversing bone loss. And this is how you do it. And once you get all your body systems to be balanced and to be harmonized, and you are digesting, absorbing, and assimilating your nutrients, sleeping well to process the daily cortisol output, when all of those are happening, then your bones don't need to keep dissolving to release the minerals to manage all of that imbalance internally. So, and
Yes.
then, for me, it's bones, but then also you don't want cancer or diabetes or all the other things that we want to avoid. That, yeah.
Exactly. It all goes together. That's the cool thing is by the time we solve stress and we then correct the digestive issues caused by stress, and we correct all of these issues we talked about, we're not just preventing bone loss or reversing bone loss for sure, but we're also preventing dementia, heart disease, cancer, autoimmunity, all the conditions that we want to prevent. So it's like you can do this and then solve everything in one.
Exactly. And that's a big thing. Cognitive decline is really a forefront, and it needs to be because fall prevention, fracture prevention is important. And you also really need that mental ability to make sure that you still take care of yourself and
Yeah.
then that doesn't happen. So it's not, it's all of it. It's all aspects. I mean, for me, I focus on bone health in particular, and that's what I speak about, but it's all facets of health. Okay, Donnie. So this has been, or Dr. Donnie, sorry. This has
It's
been
okay.
really amazing. I love that you have this quiz. It's at Dr. Donnie, Doni, right? .com. Is
Yeah.
that your website?
Yeah, you can spell it out.
drdonnie.com.
DoctorDoni.com.
Okay, perfect. And that's where you do the quiz. That's where you figure out what one of the 5 types are you. From there, you get your customized recommendations for supplementation and for the care methodology. And the care was, can you say what those that's
Clean eating, adequate sleep, recovery activities, and exercise.
yeah, so those big pillars of health. Well, thank you. And then your book, can you tell us the name of your book, your last
The
book?
book is Master Your Stress, Reset Your Health, And yeah, you can get it. It's also Audible, by the way, if you prefer to listen to books at Amazon and anywhere else that books are sold. And I'll share a link with you for the stress type supplements so you can share that with your audience.
Yes, perfect. And then extra credit if you get the Audible book and you're outside in nature listening to how to manage stress, because walking supports bone health. It manages stress, and you're going to be learning more tools. So there you're going to get, light many candles with one flame.
I love it. Yes, that's the best kind of multitasking.
That's what we need to do. We need to figure out healthy aging multitasking techniques.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining and sharing your wisdom with my community. And I am so grateful to have you as my guest today.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Debbie.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for listening to Stronger Bones Lifestyle Podcast. Bone loss is not an inevitable part of aging. We don't have to just wait for it to happen. There is so much that you can do, and that is what you will learn each week on the show. Go to my website, debbierobinson.com, if you want more information about what was shared in today's episode. At the bottom of this episode in the show notes, there will be links to whatever was shared. Please subscribe to this podcast. Share this podcast with your friends, your family, or any women that you think may be interested or benefit from the information we're sharing. Please rate the podcast. And if you have any questions you'd like asked or answered, I would love to hear from you. Let's do this, ladies. Let's change the way the world views osteoporosis and slow down, stop, or reverse our bone loss, take charge, and show other ladies what is possible. Thank you so much for joining me.